Eichmann marched into the office, firing off questions before he'd even sat down. "I got very little time. I have to be in Warsaw by tomorrow at the latest." He had already spoken to the camp commandant and the chief engineer. "How are the factories getting on? What are your impressions of Voss? Do you think the chemists are up to it?" he asked rapidly. His large white fingers, with correspondingly large pink nails, turned over the papers on the desk. From time to time he made brief notes with a fountain pen. Lys had the feeling that to him this project was no different from any other, although it aroused a secret shiver of horror in even the most hardened hearts. Lys had drunk a lot over these last few days. He was constantly short of breath, and he could feel his heart pounding during the night. In spite of this, he felt that alcohol was less damaging to his health than the constant nervous tension that was the alternative. He dreamed of returning to his research on important figures who had shown hostility towards National Socialism, of studying questions that, for all their complexity and cruelty, could at least be solved without the shedding of blood. Then he would smoke only 2 or 3 cigarettes a day, and he'd stop drinking. Not long ago he had played a game of political chess with an old Russian Bolshevik. He had gone back home afterwards, fallen asleep without having to take any tablets, and not woken up until 9 in the morning. A small surprise had been laid on for Eichmann and Lys during their tour of inspection. In the middle of the gas chamber, the engineers had laid a small table with hors d'oeuvre and wine. Reinecke invited Eichmann and Lys to sit down. Eichmann laughed at this charming idea and said, "With the greatest pleasure." He gave his cap to his bodyguard and sat down. His large face suddenly took on a look of kindly concentration, the same look that appears on the faces of millions of men as they sit down to a good meal. Reinecke poured out the wine, and they all reached for their glasses, waiting for Eichmann to propose a toast. The tension in this concrete silence, in these full glasses, was so extreme that Lys felt his heart was about to burst. What he wanted was some ringing toast to clear the atmosphere, a toast to the glory of the German ideal. Instead, the tension grew stronger. Eichmann was chewing a sandwich. "Well, gentlemen," said Eichmann, "I call that excellent ham." "We are waiting for the Master of Ceremonies to propose a toast," said Lys. Eichmann raised his glass. "To the continued success of our work. Yes, that certainly deserves a toast." Eichmann was the only man to eat well and drink very little. The following morning, wearing only a pair of underpants, Eichmann did his exercises in front of an open window. Through the mist he could make out the orderly rows of barrack huts and hear the whistles of steam engines. Lys wasn't usually envious of Eichmann. He himself enjoyed an important position without excessive responsibilities. He was considered one of the most intelligent men in the Gestapo. Himmler himself liked to chat with him. Important dignitaries usually avoided pulling their rank with him. He was used to being treated with respect. And not only within the Gestapo, the presence of the Gestapo could be felt everywhere. In universities, in the signature of the director of a children's nursing home, in auditions for young opera singers, in the jury's choice of pictures for the spring exhibition, in the list of candidates for elections to the Reichstag. It was the axis around which life turned. It was thanks to the Gestapo that the party was always right, that its philosophy triumphed over any other philosophy, its logic, or lack of logic, over any other logic. Yes, this was the magic wand. If it were dropped, a great orator would be transformed into a mere windbag. A renowned scientist would be exposed as a common plagiarist. The magic wand must never be dropped. As he looked at Eichmann, Lys, for the first time in his life, felt a twinge of envy. A few minutes before his departure, Eichmann said thoughtfully, "We're from the same town, Lys." They started to reel off the names of familiar streets, restaurants and cinemas. There are, of course, places I never visited, said Eichmann, naming a club that wouldn't have admitted the son of an artisan. Lys changed the subject. Can you give me some idea, just a rough estimate, of the number of Jews we're talking about? He knew this was the million-dollar question, a question that perhaps only 3 men in the world, other than Himmler and the Führer, could answer. But it was the right moment. After Eichmann's reminiscences about his difficult youth during the period of democracy and cosmopolitanism, for Lys to admit his ignorance, to ask about what he didn't know. Eichmann answered his question. What? Lys gasped in astonishment. Millions! Eichmann shrugged his shoulders. They remained silent for some time. I very much regret that we didn't meet during our years as students, said Lys, during our years of apprenticeship, as Goethe put it. You needn't. I studied out in the provinces, said Eichmann, not in Berlin. After a pause, he went on. It's the first time, my friend, that I pronounced that figure out loud. If we include Berchtesgaden, the Reichskanzler, and the office of our Führer, it may have been pronounced 7 or 8 times. I understand, said Lys. It won't be printed in tomorrow's newspapers. That's precisely what I mean, said Eichmann. He looked at Lys mockingly. Lys suddenly had a disturbing feeling that he was talking to someone more intelligent than himself. Apart from the fact that the quiet little town where we were born is so full of greenery, Eichmann continued, I had another reason for naming that figure. I would like it to unite us in our future collaboration. Thank you, said Lys. It's a very serious matter. I need to think about it. Of course, this proposal doesn't come only from me, said Eichmann, pointing towards the ceiling. If you join me in this task and Hitler loses, then we'll hang for it together. A charming prospect, said Lys. I need to give it some thought. Just imagine, in 2 years' time, we'll be sitting at a comfortable table in this same office and saying, in 20 months, we've solved a problem that humanity failed to solve in the course of 20 centuries. They said their farewells. Lys watched the limousine disappear. He had some ideas of his own about personal relations with the state. Life in a National Socialist state couldn't just be allowed to develop freely. Every step had to be directed. And to control and organize factories and armies, reading circles, people's summer holidays, their maternal feelings, how they breathe and sing, to control all this you need leaders. Life no longer has the right to grow freely like grass, to rise and fall like the sea. In Lys's view, there were 4 main categories of leaders. The first were the simple, undivided natures, usually people without particular intelligence or finesse. These people were full of slogans and formulae from newspapers and magazines, of quotations from Hitler's speeches, Goebbels' articles, and the books of Frank and Rosenberg. Without solid ground under their feet, they were lost. They seldom reflected on the connections between different phenomena, and they were easily moved to intolerance and cruelty. They took everything seriously. Philosophy, National Socialist science, and its obscure revelations, the new music, the achievements of the new theatre, the campaign for the elections to the Reichstag, like school children, they got together in little groups to mug up Mein Kampf, and to make précis of pamphlets and articles. They usually lived in relatively modest circumstances, sometimes experiencing actual need. They were more ready than the other categories to volunteer for posts that would take them away from their families. To begin with, Lys had thought that Eichmann belonged to this category. The second category were the intelligent cynics, the people who knew of the existence of the magic wand. In the company of friends they trusted, they were ready to laugh at most things. The ignorance of newly appointed lecturers and professors, the stupidity and lax morals of lighters and Gauleiters. The only things they never laughed at were grand ideals and the Führer himself. These men usually drank a lot and lived more expansively. They were to be met with most frequently on the higher rungs of the party hierarchy. The lower rungs were usually occupied by men of the first category. The men of the third category held sway at the very top of the hierarchy. There was only room for 9 or 10 of them, and they admitted perhaps another 15 or 20 to their gatherings. Here were no dogmas. Here everything could be discussed freely. Here were no ideals, nothing but serenity, mathematics, and the pitilessness of these great masters. It sometimes seemed that all the activities of the country were centred around them, around their well-being. Lys had noticed that the appearance of more limited minds in the higher echelons always heralded some sinister turn of events. The controllers of the social mechanism elevated the dogmatists only in order to entrust them with especially bloody tasks. These simpletons became temporarily intoxicated with power, but on the completion of their tasks they usually disappeared. Sometimes they shared the fate of their victims. The serene masters then remained in control undisturbed. The simpletons, the men of the first category, were endowed with one exceptionally valuable quality. They came from the people. Not only were they able to cite the classics of National Socialism, but they did so in the language of the people. At workers' meetings, they were able to make people laugh. Their coarseness made them seem like workers or peasants themselves. The fourth category were the executives, people who were indifferent to dogma, ideas and philosophy, and equally lacking in analytic ability. National Socialism paid them, and they served it. Their only real passion was for dinner services, suits, country houses, jewels, furniture, cars, and refrigerators. They were less fond of money, as they never fully believed in its solidity. Lys was drawn to the true leaders, the men of the third category. He dreamed of their company and their intimacy. It was in that kingdom of elegant logic, of irony and intelligence that he felt most fully himself. But at some terrifying height above even these leaders, above the stratosphere, was yet another world, the obscure, incomprehensible, and terrifyingly illogical world of Adolf Hitler himself. What Lys found most terrifying about Adolf Hitler was that he seemed to be made up of an inconceivable fusion of opposites. He was the master of masters. He was the great mechanic. His mathematical cruelty was more refined than that of all his closest lieutenants taken together. And at the same time he was possessed by a dogmatic frenzy, a blindly fanatical faith, a bullish illogicality that Lys had only met with at the very lowest, most subterranean levels of the party. The high priest, the creator of the magic wand, was also one of the faithful, a mindless, frenzied follower. Watching Eichmann's car disappear, Lys felt at once afraid of him and attracted to him. Until now, such a confusion of feelings had only been evoked in him by the Führer himself. Anti-Semitism can take many forms, from a mocking, contemptuous ill will to murderous pogroms. Anti-Semitism can be met with in the market and in the Presidium of the Academy of Sciences, in the soul of an old man and in the games of children that they play in the yard. Anti-Semitism has been as strong in the age of atomic reactors and computers as in the age of oil lamps, sailing boats, and spinning wheels. Anti-Semitism is always a means rather than an end. It is a measure of the contradictions yet to be resolved. It is a mirror for the failings of individuals, social structures, and state systems. Tell me what you accuse the Jews of. I'll tell you what you're guilty of. Even Olejniczuk, the peasant fighter for freedom who was imprisoned in Schlüsselburg, somehow expressed his hatred for serfdom as a hatred for Poles and Yids. Even a genius like Dostoevsky saw a Jewish usurer where he should have seen the pitiless eyes of a Russian serf owner. Industrialist or contractor, and in accusing the Jews of racism, a desire for world domination and a cosmopolitan indifference towards the German fatherland, National Socialism was merely describing its own features. Anti-Semitism is also an expression of a lack of talent, an inability to win a contest on equal terms in science or in commerce, in craftsmanship or in painting. States look to the imaginary intrigues of world Jewry for explanations of their own failure. At the same time, anti-Semitism is an expression of the lack of consciousness of the masses, of their inability to understand the true reasons for their sufferings. Ignorant people blame the Jews for their troubles, when they should blame the social structure or the state itself. Anti-Semitism is also, of course, a measure of the religious prejudices smouldering in the lower levels of a society. An aversion to the physical appearance of a Jew for his way of speaking and eating is certainly not a genuine cause of anti-Semitism. The same man who speaks with disgust of a Jew's curly hair, or of the way he waves his arms about, will gaze admiringly at the black curly hair of children in paintings by Murillo, will be quite undisturbed by the gesticulating and guttural speech of Armenians, and would look without aversion at the thick lips of a Negro. Anti-Semitism has a place to itself in the history of the persecution of national minorities. Anti-Semitism is a unique phenomenon, just as the history of the Jews is unique. Just as a man's shadow can give an idea of his stature, so anti-Semitism can give an idea of the history and destiny of the Jews. One trait that distinguishes the Jews from other national minorities is that their history has been bound up with a large number of religious and political issues of world importance. Another distinguishing trait is the extraordinary degree to which they are dispersed throughout both Eastern and Western hemispheres. There are Jews in nearly every country of the world. It was during the dawn of capitalism that Jewish tradesmen and usurers made their first appearance. During the Industrial Revolution, many Jews made names for themselves in the realms of industry and mechanics. During the Atomic Age, many talented Jews have been nuclear physicists, and during the epoch of revolutionary struggle, many of the most important revolutionary leaders were Jews. Rather than relegating themselves to the periphery, Jews have always chosen to play a role at the centre of a society's industrial and ideological development. This constitutes a third distinguishing trait of Jewish minorities. Part of the Jewish minority becomes assimilated into the indigenous population, but the general mass retain their peculiar religion, language, and way of life. Anti-Semitism always accuses the assimilated Jews of secret nationalist and religious aspirations. At the same time, it holds the general mass of non-assimilated Jews, the manual labourers and artisans, responsible for the actions of their fellows who become revolutionary leaders, captains of industry, atomic physicists, and important administrators. This is a fourth distinguishing trait. Each of these traits taken singly may be characteristic of some other minority, but it's only the Jews who are characterized by all of them. Anti-Semitism, as one might expect, reflects these traits. It too has always been bound up with the most important question of world politics, economics, ideology, and religion. This is its most sinister characteristic. The flames of its bonfires has lit the most terrible periods of history. When the Renaissance broke in upon the Catholic Middle Ages, the forces of darkness lit the bonfires of the Inquisition. These flames, however, not only expressed the power of evil, they also lit up the spectacle of its destruction. In the 20th century, an ill-fated nationalist regime lit the bonfires of Auschwitz, the gas ovens of Lublinsk and Treblinka. These flames not only lit up fascism's brief triumph, but also foretold its doom. Historical epochs, unsuccessful and reactionary governments, and individuals hoping to better their lot all turned to anti-Semitism as a last resort in an attempt to escape an inevitable doom. In the course of 2 millennia, have there ever been occasions when the forces of freedom and humanitarianism made use of anti-Semitism as a tool in their struggles? Possibly, but I do not know of them. There are also different levels of anti-Semitism. Firstly, there's a relatively harmless, everyday anti-Semitism. This merely bears witness to the existence of failures and envious fools. Secondly, there's social anti-Semitism. This can only arise in democratic countries. Its manifestation are in those sections of the press that represent different reactionary groups. In the activities of these groups, for example, boycotts of Jewish labour, Jewish goods, in their ideology and religion. Thirdly, in totalitarian countries, where society as such no longer exists, there can arise state anti-Semitism. This is a sign that the state is looking for the support of fools, reactionaries, and failures, that it's seeking to capitalise on the ignorance of the superstitious and the anger of the hungry. The first stage of state anti-Semitism is discrimination. The state limits the areas in which Jews can live, the choice of professions open to them, their right to occupy important positions, their access to higher education, and so on. The second stage is wholesale destruction. At a time when the forces of reaction enter into a fatal struggle against the forces of freedom, then anti-Semitism becomes an ideology of party and state, as happened with fascism. The newly formed units moved up to the front line under cover of darkness. One concentration of forces was along the River Don, to the northwest of Stalingrad. The trains unloaded in the steppe itself, along a newly constructed railway line. Just before dawn, these iron rivers suddenly congealed. All you could see then was a light cloud of dust over the steppe. Gun barrels were camouflaged with dry grass and handfuls of straw so that they blended into the autumn steppe. Nothing in the world could have seemed quieter or more peaceful. Aircraft lay on the ground like dried insects, their wings draped in camouflaged netting. Every day the network of figures grew more complex. Every day the diamonds, circles and triangles spread more thickly over the secret map. The armies of the newly formed Southwestern Front, to the northwest of Stalingrad itself, were taking up their positions in readiness to advance. Meanwhile, on the left bank of the Volga, avoiding the smoke and thunder of Stalingrad, tank corps and artillery divisions were making their way through the empty steppe towards quiet creeks and backwaters. They then crossed the Volga and took up position in the Kalmyk steppe, in the salt flats between the lakes. These forces were being concentrated on the Germans' right flank. The Soviet High Command was planning the encirclement of Paulus's army. During dark nights, under the autumn clouds and stars, Novikov's tank corps were transferred to the right bank, south of Stalingrad, by barge, steamer and ferry. Thousands of people saw the names of famous Russian generals, Kutuzov, Suvorov, Alexander Nevsky, painted in white on the armour plating of the tanks, and millions of people had seen the heavy guns, the mortars, and the columns of Lend-Lease Fords and Dodges. Nevertheless, this vast build-up of forces in readiness for the offensive remained secret. How was this possible? The Germans knew about these troop movements. It would have been no more possible to hide them than to hide the wind from a man walking through the steppe. Any German lieutenant looking at a map with approximate positions for the main concentrations of Russian forces could have guessed the most important of all Soviet military secrets, a secret known only to Stalin, Zhukov, and Vasily. How was it then that the Germans were taken by surprise, lieutenants and field marshals alike? Stalingrad itself had continued to hold out. For all the vast forces involved, the German attacks had still not led to a decisive victory. Some of the Russian regiments now only numbered a few dozen soldiers. It was these few men, bearing all the weight of the terrible fighting, who confused the calculations of the Germans. The Germans were simply unable to believe that all their attacks were being borne by a handful of men. They thought the Soviet reserves were being brought in to order to reinforce the defence. The true strategists of the Soviet offensive were the soldiers with their backs to the Volga who fought off Paulus's divisions. The remorseless cunning of history, however, lay still more deeply hidden. Freedom engendered the Russian victory. Freedom was the apparent aim of the war. But the sly fingers of history changed this. Freedom became simply a way of waging the war, a means to an end. A marvellous but somehow exhausting silence lay over the Kalmyk steppe. Did the men hurrying that very morning along Unter den Linden know what was about to happen? Did they know that Russia had now turned her face toward the west, that she was about to strike, about to advance? "Don't forget the coats," Novikov called out from the porch of Kharitonov to Kharitonov, his driver. "Mine and the Commissar's. We won't be back till late." Getmanov and Newbodnov followed him out. "Mikhail Petrovich," said Novikov, "if anything happens, phone Karpov. Or if it's after 3 o'clock, get hold of Bylov and Makarov." "What do you think could happen here?" asked Newbodnov. "Who knows? Maybe a visit from one of the brass hats." Two small points appeared out of the sun and swooped down over the village. The whine of engines grew louder. The still silence of the steppe was shattered. Kharitonov leapt out of the jeep and ran for shelter behind the wall of a barn. "A fool!" shouted Getmanov. "They're our own planes!" At that very moment, one plane released a bomb, and the other let out a burst of machine gun fire. The air howled. There was a sound of shattering glass. A woman let out a piercing scream. A child began to cry. Clods of earth rained down on the ground. Novikov ducked as he heard the bomb fall. For a moment everything was drowned in dust and smoke. All he could see was Getmanov standing beside him. Then Newbodnov emerged, standing very upright, shoulders straight and head erect. It was as though he was carved out of wood. A little pale, but animated and full of excitement, Getmanov brushed the dust off his trousers. With an endearing boastfulness he said, "Oh, that's a mercy. My trousers are still dry, and as for our general, he didn't even bat an eyelid." Getmanov and Newbodnov went off to look at the bomb crater and see how far the earth had been thrown. They examined a piece of smashed fencing and were surprised to see that the windows of the more distant houses had been broken, but not those of the near ones. Novikov watched the two men with curiosity. It was as though they were surprised that the bomb should have been made in the factory, carried into the sky, dropped to the earth with only one aim, that of killing the fathers of little Getmanovs and Newbodnovs. It was as though they were thinking, so that's what people get up to during a war. Getmanov was still talking about the raid when they set off, and then he cut himself short and said, "You must find it amusing to listen to me, Pyotr Pavlovitch. You've already seen thousands of them, but that was my first time." Then another thought struck him. "Oh, listen, Pyotr Pavlovitch, this Krimov fellow, tell me, was he ever taken prisoner?" "Krimov? Why do you ask?" "It's just that I heard an interesting conversation about him at front headquarters. His unit was once encircled, but no, I don't think he was ever taken prisoner. What was this conversation anyway?" As though he hadn't heard, Getmanov tapped Kharitonov on the shoulder and said, That road there goes straight to the HQ of 1st Brigade, and we can't avoid the ravine. See if I haven't learnt to orientate myself." Novikov was already used to the way Getmanov could never follow one train of thought. He'd begin telling a story, suddenly ask a question, and carry on with the story, then interrupt himself with another question. His thoughts appeared to move in zigzags, with no rhyme or reason. Novikov knew, however, that this was by no means the case. Getmanov often talked about his wife and children. He carried a thick packet of family photographs around with him, and he had twice sent men off to Ufa with parcels of food. But as soon as he had arrived, he had begun an affair, and quite a serious one at that, with Tamara Pavlovna, a swarthy, bad-tempered doctor from the first aid post. One morning Vershkov had announced in a tragic voice, "Comrade Colonel, the doctor spent the night with the commissar. He didn't let her go till dawn." "That's none of your business, Vershkov," Novikov had answered, "and I'd rather you stop bringing me sweets on the sly." Getmanov made no secret of his affair. There in the jeep he nudged Novikov and whispered, "Pyotr Pavlovitch, I know a lad who's fallen in love with our doctor." "A commissar, I believe," said Novikov, glancing at the driver. "Well, Bolsheviks aren't monks," Getmanov explained in a whisper. "What could the poor fool do? He's fallen in love." They were silent for a few minutes. Then, in a quite different tone of voice, Getmanov said, "And as for you, Pyotr Pavlovitch, you're certainly not getting any thinner. You must be in your element here, the same as I'm in my element working for the party. That's what I was made for. I arrived at my obcom at the most difficult moment. Anyone else would have had a heart attack. The plan for grain deliveries was in tatters. Stalin himself spoke to me twice on the telephone, and I just put on weight for all the world as though I were on holiday." "God only knows what I was made for," said Novikov. "Maybe I really was made for war." He laughed. "One thing I've noticed. Whenever anything interesting happens, I immediately think, I must remember to tell Yevgenia Nikolaevna. After that raid, I thought, I mustn't forget to tell her. Getmanov and Nybodnov have seen their first bomb." "So you're drawing up political reports, are you?" asked Getmanov. "That's right." "I can understand," said Getmanov. "There's no one closer than one's wife." They reached Brigade HQ and got out of the jeep. Novikov's head was always full of names of people and places, of problems, difficulties, questions to be resolved, and questions that had just been resolved, in orders to be given, orders to be countermanded. Sometimes he'd wake up at night and begin wondering anxiously whether or not it was right to open fire at distances exceeding the range of the sighting gear. Was it really worth firing while on the move? And would his officers be able to take stock of a changing situation quickly and accurately? Would they be able to take decisions independently on the spot? Then he imagined his tanks breaking through the German and Romanian defences. Column after column they entered the breach and set off in pursuit of the enemy. In liaison with ground support aircraft, self-propelled guns, motorised infantry, they drove further and further towards the west, sieging fords and bridges, avoiding minefields, crushing pockets of resistance. Out of breath with joy and excitement, Novikov would sit up in bed, his bare feet touching the floor. He never felt any desire to tell Getmanov about such moments. Here in the steppe he felt even more irritated with him and Nybodnov than he had in the Urals. "They've arrived just in time for dessert," he'd sometimes say to himself. He himself was no longer the man he'd been in 1941. He drank more, swore a lot, and become quick-tempered. Once he'd almost hit the officer responsible for fuel supplies. People were afraid of him, and he knew it. "I don't know if I really am made for war," he said Getmanov. "The best thing in the world would be to live in a hut, in the forest, together with the woman you love. You'd go hunting during the day and come back home in the evening. She'd cook you a meal, and then you'd go to bed. War's no nourishment for a man." Getmanov, his head cocked, watched him attentively. Colonel Karpov, the commander of the brigade, was a man with puffy cheeks, red hair, and piercingly blue eyes. He met Novikov and Getmanov by the field wireless set. He had seen service on the Northwest Front, There he had more than once had to dig in his tanks and use them simply as guns. He accompanied Novikov and Getmanov on their inspection of the 1st Brigade. His movements were calm and unhurried, as if he were himself the senior officer. From his build, you would have expected him to be a good-natured man who drank too much beer and enjoyed a good meal. But in fact he was cold, taciturn, suspicious, and petty-minded. He was far from a generous host, had a reputation for miserliness. Getmanov praised the conscientiousness with which bunkers, artillery emplacements, and tank shelters had been constructed. He had indeed taken everything into consideration: types of terrain over which an enemy attack would be practicable, the possibility of a flanking movement. All he had forgotten was that he would now be required to lead his brigade into the attack, to break through the enemy front, to take up the pursuit. Novikov was annoyed by Getmanov's repeated nods and words of approval. Meanwhile, Karpov, as though intentionally adding fuel to the flames, was saying, "Comrade Colonel, let me tell you how things were in Odessa. Well, we were quite splendidly entrenched. We counterattacked in the evening and dealt the Romanians a good blow. And then that night the army commander had us all embark on board ship, right down to the last man. Around 9 o'clock in the morning, the Romanians finally came to and stormed the empty trenches. But by then we were already on the Black Sea." "Well, I just hope you don't hang around in front of empty Romanian trenches," said Novikov. Would Karpov be capable of pressing on ahead, day and night, leaving pockets of enemy resistance behind him? Would he be able to forge on, exposing his head, his neck, his flanks? Would he be seized by the fury of pursuit? No, that was not his nature. Everything was still parched by the heat of summer. It was strange to find the air so cool. The soldiers were all busy with everyday concerns. One, sitting on top of his tank, was shaving in front of a mirror he had propped against the turret. Another was cleaning his rifle. Another was writing a letter. There was a group playing dominoes on a tarpaulin they'd spread out. Another, larger group had gathered, yawning, around the nurse. The sky was vast and the earth was vast. This everyday picture was full of the sadness of early evening. Suddenly a battalion commander rushed up. Putting his tunic straight as he ran, he shouted, "Battalion, attention, at ease, at ease," said Novikov. Getmanov walked about among the men, saying a few words here and there. They all laughed, their faces brightening as they exchanged glances. He asked whether they were missing the girls from the Urals, whether they had wasted a lot of paper in writing letters, whether their copies of Red Star came regularly. Then he turned on the quartermaster. "What did the soldiers have to eat today? And yesterday? And the day before yesterday? Is that what you had to eat for the last 3 days, soup made from green tomatoes and barley? Let me have a word with the cook," he demanded, to the accompaniment of general laughter. "I'd like to know what the quartermaster had to eat today." Through these questions about everyday life, of the soldiers and their material welfare, Getmanov seemed almost to be reproaching their commanding officers. It was as though he was saying, "Why do you go on and on all the time about the ordnance? What about the men themselves?" The quartermaster himself, a thin man with red hands of a washerwoman, just stood there in his old dusty boots. Every now and then he cleared his throat nervously. Novikov felt sorry for him. "Comrade Commissar," he said, "shall we visit Barlov's together?" Getmanov had always, with reason, been considered a man of the masses, a born leader. He only had to open his mouth for people to laugh. His vivid way of talking, his sometimes vulgar language, quickly bridged the distance between the secretary of an obcom and a worker in overalls. He always began by asking about material matters. Did they get their wages on time? Was the shop in the factory or village well supplied? Or were some items always unobtainable? Was the workers' hostel well heated? How was the food from the field kitchen? He had a particular gift for talking to middle-aged women in factories and collective farms. They liked the way he showed himself to be a true servant of the people, the way he was ready to attack managers, food suppliers, wardens of hostels, managers of tractor stations and factories, if they failed to take into account the interests of the working man. He was the son of a peasant. He had worked in a factory himself, and the workers could sense this. In his office at the Obcom, however, he was a different man. There, his sole concern was his responsibility towards the state. There, his only preoccupations were the preoccupations of Moscow. The factory managers and secretaries of rural raycoms knew this very well. You realize that you're disrupting the state plan, do you? Do you want to surrender your party membership card right now? Are you aware the party's placed its trust in you? Need I say more? There were no jokes or pleasantries in his office. No talk of providing boiling water in hostels or more greenery in the factories. Instead, people gave their approval to tight productive schedules, agreed to the construction of new housing, that it should be postponed, that the workers would have to increase their daily output. They'd all have to tighten their belts, slash costs, and increase retail prices. It was during the meetings held in his office that Getmanov's power could be felt most tangibly. Other people seemed to come to these meetings not to express ideas and demands of their own, but simply to help Getmanov. It was as though the whole course of these meetings had been determined in advance by Getmanov's will and intelligence. He spoke quietly and unhurriedly, confident of his listeners' agreement. Let's hear about your region first, then. Comrades, we'll have a word with the agronomist. Then we'd like to hear your point of view, Pyotr Mikhailovich. I think Glasgow has something to tell us. He's had certain problems in that area. Res, Rodionov, I know you've got something on the tip of your tongue, but in my opinion, the matter's quite clear. It's time we began to sum up. I don't think there can be any objections. Perhaps I can call on you, Rodionov, to read out this draft resolution. And Rodionov, who had intended to express certain doubts or even disagreements, would conscientiously read out the resolution, glancing now and again at the chairman to see if he was reading it clearly enough. Well, comrades, it seems we're all in favour. What was most extraordinary of all was that Getmanov always seemed to be absolutely sincere. He was fully himself when he was commiserating with old women in a village, Soviet, or expressing regret at the cramped conditions in a workers' hostel. He was equally himself when he insisted to the secretary of a raycom on 100% fulfilment of the plan, or when he deprived workers on a collective farm of their entitlement to a few last grains of corn, or when he decreased wages, increased retail prices, and demanded lower overheads. All this was far from easy to understand. But is life ever easy to understand? As they made their way back to the jeep, Getmanov said jokingly to Karpov, We'll have to have lunch at Bailov's. It's hardly worth waiting for a meal from you and your quartermaster. Comrade Commissar, replied Karpov, the quartermaster still hasn't received anything from HQ stores, and he hardly eats anything at all himself. He's got a bad stomach. A bad stomach? Aye, poor man, yawned Getmanov as he signed to the driver to start. Bailov's brigade was positioned some distance to the west of Karpov's. He was a thin man with a large nose and the crooked legs of a cavalryman. He spoke rapidly, and he had a sharp, intelligent mind. Novikov liked him, and he seemed the ideal man to effect a sudden breakthrough and a swift pursuit. He was thought highly of, despite his relative lack of experience. Last December, near Moscow, he had led a raid on the enemy rear. Now, though, Novikov was anxiously conscious only of Bailov's failings. He was forgetful and frivolous, he drank like a fish, he was too much of a womanizer, and he was disliked by his subordinates. He had prepared no defensive positions whatsoever. He seemed quite uninterested in logistics, with the exception of fuel and ammunition supplies. He hadn't given enough thought to the matter of the evacuation of damaged tanks from the battlefield and their subsequent repair. We're not in the Urals any longer, Comrade Bailov, said Novikov. Yes, said Getmanov, we're encamped on the steppes, like gypsies. I've taken measures against attacks from the air, Bailov pointed out, but at this distance from the front line, a ground attack seems hardly probable. Anyway, Comrade Colonel, he announced with a loud sigh, what my soul thirsts for is an offensive. Very good, Bailov, very good, said Getmanov. You're a true commander, a real Soviet Suvorov." Then, addressing him as "Tu," he added in a quiet, good-humoured tone of voice, "The head of the political section says you're having an affair with a nurse. Is that so?" At first, misled by Getmanov's friendly tone, Bylov didn't understand the question. I'm sorry, what did he say?" Then Getmanov's meaning became clear. With obvious embarrassment, he said, "I'm a man, Comrade Commissar, and we are in the field." "You've got a wife and child." "3 children," said Bylov sullenly. "3 children, then. Well, you know what happened to Bulanovich in the 1st Brigade. He's a fine officer, but he was relieved of his command because of an affair like this. What kind of example are you setting your subordinates? A Russian officer, and the father of 3 children?" Suddenly, Bylov protested. "Seeing as I didn't use force, it's of no concern to anyone else. And as for setting an example, it's been done before you and me, and before your father." Without raising his voice, but now addressing him as V, Getmanov said, "Remember your party membership card, Comrade Bylov, and you should stand to attention when a superior officer addresses you." Standing rigidly to attention, Bylov said, "Excuse me, Comrade Commissar. I understand. I realize my error. The Corps Commander and I are confident of your fighting abilities, but take care not to disgrace yourself in your personal life." Getmanov looked at his watch and turned to Novikov. "Pyotr Pavlovich, I haven't got time to go with you to Makarov's. I have to be at headquarters. I'll borrow a jeep from Bylov." They left the bunker. Unable to restrain himself, Novikov asked, "Can't you wait to see your Tamara, then?" 2 frosty eyes looked at him in astonishment. An irritated voice said, "I've been called to front headquarters by the member of the military Soviet." Novikov went on by himself to visit Makarov, the commander of the 3rd Brigade, and a favourite of his.